Corporate career responsibility is a call to all experts and consultants to give back their time, skills, knowledge, and expertise to mentor and nurture future industry leaders. Are you passionate in nurturing future industry leaders and professionals who will take enterprise to a higher level? Corporate Career Academy, together with Student TV, is giving you an opportunity to share your knowledge, skills, and mentor students and young professionals.
Speaking to Nathan Meehan from the CMG Consulting, Petroleum Consulting Energy Advisory Firm from the US. My name is Philip Pandey, your moderator for this evening, MD Winam Capital and an associate of Corporate Career Academy. So thank you all for joining us and for subscribing to our YouTube channel, Corporate Careers Academy. And thank you all that are watching us via Facebook Live. We hope that then this session adds value to students that are taking petroleum engineering as a course and all those in the engineering field, the energy field as well, and practitioners in the spaces of energy, oil, and gas. Welcome aboard, and thank you, Nathan, for joining us this evening. Please feel part of this discussion. I would want to give you an opportunity to have a brief introduction about yourself and about the discussion that we are just about to give. Welcome.
Great. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, very well, Nathan. Go ahead, tell us who you are, and we'll give you the first few minutes of the discussion to make a presentation, if at all that's available. And then we will have an opportunity for our participants to ask questions. Please feel free to type questions on Facebook Live, our page, and we will be posting them to the speaker towards the tail end of our discussion. So Nathan, it's your opportunity. Please talk to us.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, look, it's my pleasure. I do have a presentation, but first, by way of introduction, let me say that I'm a petroleum engineer. I've worked in the industry more than 40 years. In fact, wow, since about 1975. So that seems like a long, long time. Anyway, I talk a little bit about petroleum engineering. That's what I am. I have 6 children. I'm married. I have 10 grandchildren, 9 boys and 1 girl. I went to Georgia Tech for a degree in physics as an undergraduate. I have a master's degree from the University of Oklahoma and a PhD from Stanford. So I raise bees. I am a Texas barbecue guy. I do lots of brisket and ribs. Those are my favorite things to cook. I also, enjoy the outdoors, have a good time mainly with my grandkids. And so they're a really fun group. I would like to go ahead and start now. I'll go ahead and share some slides.
Very well, Nathan. It's your opportunity, and very much thank you for your introduction. Your family sounds more of an African setting. We hope then that you find space in not just our discussion, but a social setting. Of course, we have very good nyama choma in place of your barbecue. So please feel free and have this discussion with your audience who perhaps do not only enjoy the industry, but your kind of meals as well. Go on.
Great, thank you. All right, so I don't know how many of you know anything about petroleum engineering. So I'm going to start at the very beginning, and I normally talk to petroleum engineers, so they already know what we do. Petroleum engineering is a specialized subset of engineering that deals with identifying the location of oil and gas in subsurface reservoirs. I mean, we all, you go to the petrol station, you're getting gasoline. Gasoline is a refined product of crude oil. So both crude oil and natural gas occur and they are found in subsurface reservoirs, which are rock formations with small pores, and you drill a well into those, which is something petroleum engineers do. And if you're able to find it, which of course we work with geologists and geophysicists to find the most likely place, we try to coax that oil and gas to flow to the surface, and then it's subsequently used in a wide variety of things. In fact, it's almost an unimaginable list of things that contain petroleum. But the petroleum engineer's job is very widespread. Drilling the wells, completing the wells, testing them, producing the wells, increasing the oil and gas recovery, estimating how much oil and gas is in the subsurface and how much we're going to be able to get out, trying to increase that amount, trying to do the economics associated with that. There are a lot of engineering things that we do, and it has historically been one of the better paying engineering jobs. Now, as a rule, engineering jobs are good professional paying jobs. And for many years, at least in the United States, petroleum engineering was the best paying one. That little bit is a supply and demand issue. So a large number of petroleum engineers in the world and the United States in addition actually have their degrees in chemical engineering or mechanical engineering or some other engineering discipline, and have come over and learned more about petroleum engineering. Not uncommon for someone to take an undergraduate degree in a different engineering discipline or even physics like me, and then switch over and do advanced degrees in petroleum engineering. So if you're studying mechanical or chemical, you could conceivably do a master's in petroleum. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we face and see if you really think that petroleum engineering might be for you, because we face a little bit of an uncertain future. I wrote an article in our society magazines, and for all of 2019, this is just how many downloads in the last 30 days. It had been downloaded thousands of times, called The End of Petroleum Engineering as We Know It. And some people don't seem to read the whole title and seem to think I was talking about the end of petroleum engineering. I'm talking about sort of the petroleum engineering that if I was to give this talk 15 years ago, I would be talking about. I think we've made a big change, and the future of our industry is going to be making the oil and gas business more sustainable, lowering the carbon emissions of our industry, and the huge emphasis we're going to have on data analytics. So, you know, the industry hires a lot of people in supply chain and in data analytics and computing and a lot of advanced technologies. We're going to do far more of that in the future. So I've kind of been talking a little bit about petroleum engineering. I'll leave room for you if you've really got some more questions at the end. I'm going to sort of have the opportunity to engage with you there. But I understand, you know, we have some. When I first came to Nairobi, there was we were talking about oil, and we weren't talking about oil in Kenya. Now I realize there have been some discoveries in Kenya since then, but we were talking about to various partners about oil opportunities in multiple countries in the greater East Africa. I think Philip reminded me, or McCory reminded me that
absolutely, that's true. That we have endowment of oil, and that's in Kenya. Particularly, we're talking about the northern Kenya, Turkana County, which already is exporting. I mean, in terms of trying to leverage in the opportunity of mining and refining oil. Yeah. So mostly we are doing crude oil from Turkana. but we have a lot of oil resources in the East Africa community. And of course, you will read a number of articles and documentation on Africa being the frontier of oil and gas, a lot of untapped resources. So it's true to say that Kenya has such resources.
There are a number of basins. There are a number of basins that are poorly explored in East Africa onshore, and there have been a number of really large discoveries of natural gas offshore East Africa in very deep waters. And almost everyone is convinced there's going to be quite a bit more ultimately. So like I mentioned, I have been to Kenya. The country is beautiful and fascinating to tourists. I spent most of my time there in a hotel having meetings, but we did manage to get to see a few things. You have a national park that's inside of city limits. It's quite interesting.
The only one.
All right, the only one. This graph shows the gross national income per person as a function of the energy use per person. So to the right, all of these countries use a lot of energy, and these countries use very little energy per person. And so the size of the dots are corresponding to populations. And what do we have in common with all the countries? And these are primarily African countries that use very little energy per person. They have lower incomes. And you see this measure of quality of life. Well, gross national income is not necessarily quality of life, but it's bound to be correlated. And the fact is, every measure of quality of life that is sort of one of these analytic things, access to clean water, access to electricity, infant mortality, child mortality, literacy rates, access to education, all of them are correlated with energy use. And so having safe, clean, affordable energy is one of the things that drives these various measures of quality of life. Now, where do we get this energy? Well, it's not all, right now we just get a tiny bit of it from renewables. The majority of the energy we get is from fossil fuels. There are, of course, some countries in East Africa that are blessed with some hydro, basically capturing the gravitational energy associated with water flows. But those are frequently only reliable for half the year. If you look at northern Tanzania, they have a lot of electric power that comes from their hydro, but they don't have it all year long. And a lot of it is used up by the gold mining sector. All right, so this is no matter which measure I put over here on access literacy rates or infant mortality, we get this same sort of behavior. And the job of petroleum engineers is to provide safe, affordable energy for the world. And one of the things that will improve the quality of life, but if it's done right, for much of Africa, will be to enable greater electricity, greater access to energy. Those all come with a cost. I don't think there's anybody that wants Kenya to be Japan. Kenya is Kenya. You have very unique things, but would having safe, affordable electricity improve the quality of life? I think so. Now, the type of energy we rely on is forecast to change. This is where we are now, 2021. And right now, oil and gas provide a huge part, something like 65% of all the world's energy demand. And if you add coal to that, you see that most of our energy comes from fossil fuels. In other words, this is the way oil and gas and coal were made. Is essentially biofuels that were trapped for millions of years and converted to something else. The world uses a little bit of nuclear. The world uses some hydro, and we use a little bit of renewables. Okay, right now, renewables are a small part of the total. This forecast shows that oil demand will decrease slightly. Natural gas demand roughly flat. Coal demand should decrease. And the bulk of the growth will be in renewables. But even so, oil and gas will remain very large. And because these oil and gas resources deplete, their production declines over time, we'll need to continue to add oil and gas. We are not going to be out of the oil and gas industry for a long, long time. That said, the growth rates for solar and wind, this black line on the bottom is the forecast we made in 2006. And here's the forecast we made in 2010 and 2016. And every year we're having to increase the forecast because the actual growth rates are higher than we thought they were. Part of that's because of the trillions of dollars that governments have spent funding research and development in subsidizing these types of renewable energy. And these subsidies have enabled us to dramatically increase how much solar and wind, even though that has not actually been economical on its own. That's not necessarily true going forward. Although there are still subsidies, there are places that solar and wind compete head-to-head on new facilities compared to other sources of energy. Now, I show you this graph. It's a little confusing, and so I'll explain it. The red and green curves this is just for the United States. A similar thing happens in the world. But the world's response to price is slower and more muted than the US is, and I can explain why. The red line is the number of drilling rigs active as a function of time. The green line is the number of oil rigs active, and the black line is the total number of rigs. So we'll just look at the total. And this blue line here is the price of crude oil, and it's for the axis on the right, which is basically just a tenth of the axis on the left. So for a long time in the 1980s, you saw crude oil prices in this $20 to $30 a barrel range. And during that time, drilling rigs were maybe 800 or so in the US. This was recovering. This was not a good time for the oil and gas industry. Relatively low prices. But then something started happening in natural gas, where natural gas prices increased sooner than oil did. And we began drilling unconventional wells that had multiple stage hydraulic fractures. This was pretty exciting stuff because all of a sudden we started drilling a lot of wells, and we saw that increase very dramatically to where we'd gone from maybe 800 rigs to 2,000 rigs, and demand for petroleum engineers was skyrocketing. Well, crude oil prices also rose. Okay. And so this was sort of as low as it got. This is as high as it got. But you see, crude oil went to $140 a barrel, and drilling activity just zoomed. We had a collapse associated with the global financial crisis of 2008, but oil prices then increased to almost $100 a barrel for this entire time frame, 2011 to 2015. And the oil rigs started drilling unconventional wells. Rig activity was huge. Man, it was good stuff. And then we had another peak at that time, followed by a huge crash. Crude oil prices dropped down to $25 a barrel. And they'd been, over 100. So there were a lot of layoffs. There was a lot of contraction in the industry. There was a recovery that had $50, $60 oil, and rig activity went back up. It was starting to look good. And then we had the COVID-19 impact, where it dropped rather dramatically. Oil prices actually went negative one day. And then we have sort of the same sort of behavior in the international rig count. We'll take a look at the African rig count, which is this light green curve. There's still I guess I don't know what you're seeing on that curve, but it's this curve here, if you can see this curve. And what you see is that African drilling rates did increase during that time frame, more than double what they'd been 10 years earlier. And they dropped off with the collapse of oil prices, not quite as dramatically. And so these were those same points I put on the previous graph. And you see that the international rig count responds a little more slowly, partially because there's more of a tendency for longer term projects, and people tend to drill in total fewer wells. You see, this is the whole international rig count is, we're looking at numbers like 1,000, and here you're looking at maybe 2,000 just in the U.S. So petroleum engineering has always been seen as a really good job, but people you get a lot of negative thoughts about it. Part of it's because of the declines and associated with layoffs and the cyclical demand, where a significant number of people lose their jobs. A lot of people don't realize how much we're going to be needed long term. A lot of people associate things like fracking. So even people who don't know what fracking is, which, by the way, is sort of one of my areas of expertise, they just assume it's got to be bad because everybody talks bad about it. And in fact, hydraulic fracturing is relatively, clean. It's been done millions of times without any problems. So other industries like mining engineering have seen declines in the past. Now, we mine a lot of stuff today, but the number of mining engineers graduating every year and getting jobs goes down. Africa's got very active mining and probably more opportunities. Africa and Australia probably have more opportunities in the mining areas than North American miners, which our mines are very old and far less capable. Rare earth and chromium and some of the other specialized mines, other things associated with renewables are all humming. The mining engineering is one that we are closely sort of cousins to them, if you will. We are both extractive industries. Textile engineering, once upon a time, that had a very high rate of job placement. Today, there's only one college left in America that offers a degree in textile engineering. So some people have said, is petroleum engineering going to wind up like textile engineering? And I think not. I think we're going to play a part in the long-term success. If you look at the kind of things that we do, nanotechnology, material science, these are things that you're going to have to learn about some way or the other if you're going to specialize in them. I'm really excited about the possibilities for petroleum engineering. And I just want to mention something about the kind of jobs. I'm going to skip some of this. And right now, I'm just going to go over to a white screen so I can talk for a second. I'd like to take just a minute to talk about what kind of jobs, where you would work in the oil and gas industry. And I'll go with the biggest ones first. The biggest one, of course, is for oil companies or oil and gas companies. They hire more petroleum engineers than anybody else. And oil and gas companies range in size from enormous organizations that everybody in the world has heard of. Exxon, Chevron, Total, Shell, BP, Saudi Aramco. Everyone knows who these companies are. They run down to the very smallest country. There are in the U.S. thousands of oil companies, and a lot of them are 1 or 2 or 5 people, because it doesn't take many people to invest in the oil and gas industry. So some companies actually are the operators. They go out and drill the wells. They hire other people to actually do essentially all of the work, but they're the ones making the decision about where the wells should be drilled, how deep is it, etc., and actually deciding which of the various service providers are used. Which leads me to the next biggest part of the jobs is the service companies. Now, the biggest ones you've probably heard of include Schlumberger, Baker Hughes, Halliburton. These almost everybody in the oil and gas industry certainly has heard of. And these companies provide the services. Some companies provide the drilling rig, some provide the pipes and the steel, and there are thousands of service companies involved. And petroleum engineers are hired by almost all of them. There are also regulatory bodies that hire petroleum engineers. There are providers of the various things that go to the service companies that hire them. So there are and there's providers of software to the industry that hire petroleum engineers. In fact, when I got my PhD at Stanford, of the dozen petroleum engineers that had just finished their PhDs in the previous year, more than half of them went to software companies, as opposed to going to oil companies or service companies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some energy transition issues, and because I want to face this head on. The biggest challenge that we have is, everybody hates us and think we're responsible for global warming. Well, I don't think there's any question that we need to decarbonize the energy system. There is overwhelming scientific evidence, observational evidence, and there's an enormous amount of global engagement, which means there are going to be regulatory pressures. And if you just heard that, you might think, well, I don't want to be a petroleum engineer. In fact, I hope to show you that one of the most important technologies is something that only petroleum engineers can do. And so CO2 emissions globally have been, for many years, the United States was the largest emitter of CO2. This red curve is China. And during this time period, from a little before 2000 to about 2013, China was building over 50 new coal-fired power plants a year. One new power plant coal-fired power plant per week. Okay. As a result of the world essentially making the decision to export much of its manufacturing, and when I say the world, I really mean the United States and Europe. They're the ones that exported manufacturing capacity to China. As a result, China relied mainly on coal, and they became far and away the largest CO2 emitter. The United States CO2 emissions dropped rather dramatically. In terms of absolute drop, it was the biggest drop of any group in the world. And that was entirely driven by burning less coal and burning more natural gas. So if you're making electricity and burn natural gas, you emit half as much CO2 as you do burning coal. And so that's substituting for coal and getting rid of coal with natural gas is the most proven thing that we can do that has been implemented at really world scale. The only thing that we've done that you can see at the scale of this graph. All the rest of it is little bumps you can't see. Some people are wondering, do we even have an opportunity to save? Are we gone? Are we done? Are we already cooked? Well, we're not cooked. This graph is cumulative CO2 emissions in gigatons as a function of time. So you can see that we've been emitting at a slightly increasing rate and now more or less a constant rate lately. And if we continue at that constant rate, we would have a high probability of going through 3 degrees C global warming by about 2060. And certainly would be above, we have a very high probability of getting above 2 degrees C by, almost 2040. But if we were able to decrease carbon emissions 2% per year, or 4% per year, which is the sort of the minimum reduction that I think we need to do as a world, we would have a decent chance of keeping it below 2. You'll hear people talking about, now this 2 degrees C and 3 degrees C, let me explain what those are. This is global temperature rise above pre-industrial levels. So before we started burning coal we really started burning coal to some degree in the middle 18th century. But now, if you look at the graphs, you can't really notice how much that we started burning coal until the late 1800s. So if you want to go back in terms of, we're not going to be able to cool the planet back off. But we have a chance to keep the worst impacts of global warming if we're able to substantially decrease the CO2 emissions. The way we've done this in the United States have been dramatic increases in natural gas production. That led to, these are the CO2 emissions. It's a little more pronounced when I plot it on this kind of scale. And the natural gas production increasing and the CO2 emissions decreasing are completely correlated. So if you look at the places, and of course you could make the same impact, you could make a much larger impact in China if we displaced all that coal-fired power plants with natural gas. It would require a lot of gas imports to China, and gas imports to China are already increasing and are slated to continue. It doesn't take much of a price. You've probably heard of the idea of a price on carbon or a carbon tax. If you got questions about those, fire away. A lot of countries already have them. A lot of countries already have relatively small ones. But if you had a tax on carbon, then new coal plants would never be sort of built again. Natural gas would be cheaper. There's a lot of policy decisions that we can do that will drive behaviors to improved sustainability. There are politicians who simply, and others who simply don't want oil or gas. But frankly, I'm convinced that we're going to need oil and gas for a very long time. We go and try to measure the intensity of CO2 emissions by country. By intensity, I mean the amount of CO2 equivalent, because I basically include CO2 and methane emissions. Methane emissions is converted to CO2. Methane is much worse for the greenhouse gas effect than CO2 is. We convert it all to CO2 equivalent emissions and look at all the sources in the process of drilling and developing and producing that oil. And we look at the CO2 emissions by all of the different areas, and then the total is the black curve. And we see that there are countries that emit a lot more than other countries. And we look and identify on individual fields just, where are these emissions? How can we improve it? Petroleum engineers are the best suited to identify and improve the emissions from oil and gas. So if we had the whole world's oil and gas production, and we could get it as clean as the best in class for the world, we would dramatically improve the sustainability of oil and gas. And this is something that I think we can't all get to where Saudi Arabia is, because they've got some relatively special things going on there. But we could all get down to this scale. Even these operators can improve. If you go look at this carbon emissions, the number here below each country's name is their total, but the color is corresponding to sort of how bad their emissions are. I don't have data for East Africa, but you can see that Nigeria, a pretty big total number. They've had a lot of flaring in Nigeria. Has been one of the more problematic countries historically. Their flaring has been decreasing somewhat. Flaring is the number one source of carbon emissions associated with oil and gas production. And this flaring intensity is sort of how much gas per barrel of oil. And you can see that the world-class numbers are low. And even the US is 4 or 5 times the world-class numbers. Well, that looks more like we're, almost 4 times the world-class numbers. Whereas the worst flarers continue at very high rates. Now, this is flaring intensity. If you wanted to look at just the total amount of gas that's flared, Russia is the largest flaring country in the world. But that's, it's per barrel is a little lower, but in total, it flares a tremendous amount of natural gas. And the impact in the environment is from the total. Nigeria continues to be a big contributor to the total. With all the CO2 emissions, there are 3 major areas where we have to do something to reach these sort of Paris goals or to improve the sustainability of the planet. The first one is dramatic increases in efficiency. The second one is increasing use of renewables. And the third one is the capture and storage of carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And so carbon in the atmosphere, right now we have about 400 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere. And it was 200, 100 years ago. How do we get such a low concentration of CO2 out of the atmosphere? Well, one possibility is that we grab emissions as they occur. So in other words, you go to the factories that are, a steel factory, a cement factory, other places that emit a lot of carbon, and instead of allowing that to escape to the atmosphere, we capture it there at the tailpipe and then manage to store it. Well, how do you store carbon dioxide? Well, one way is to inject it into underground reservoirs. Well, who knows how to do that? Well, that's petroleum engineers. We've been gathering gas and injecting it into underground reservoirs for decades. We understand how to identify the right kind of reservoirs where the gas will stay, and we'll have the tools to be able to prove and monitor those reservoirs that will stay. We understand all of that stuff. So petroleum engineers are, I want to say, the most important, but one of the most important contributors to carbon capture and storage. The scale of carbon capture and storage initiatives that we're going to need is mind-boggling. Today, we do, this slide's a little old, maybe about 40 megatons of CO2 per year. Now, remember that graph I showed you before, it was gigatons, not megatons. And so to achieve the Paris goals, by 2040, or I don't know why I got this at 2037, but to achieve the Paris goals, we're going to need a dramatic increase in production. This is the current global level of oil production in terms of barrels per year. We're going to need to exceed that by the 2030s to get to this 3.5 gigatons per year. And to get to where we ultimately need to be by 2050, 6 gigatons per year, compared to 30 today. So that's 100 times and 200 times as much as we do today. And that will require huge amounts of storage. Now, this is not the only method for storing. It's really the only proven method for storing CO2 at volume. So petroleum engineers are absolutely vital for the energy transition. We need to develop oil and gas things that are less carbon intensive, eliminate flaring and methane leaks. We need to remove coal from the process by providing natural gas that's essentially more affordable. We need to radically increase carbon capture and storage and improve the efficiency of our systems. We're going to continue to be using a lot of big data and AI, machine learning, to improve every aspect of our industry and head to net zero emission opportunities for fossil fuels. Now, I wanted to go ahead and open this up to have some conversation, have your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nathan, for that discussion. We really appreciate that you've really taken it through. For those of us who are not engineers, we've been able to follow very well, but I really understood the graphs and what you've been able to take us through. So I want to take this back to the audience who is watching us, and I appreciate those who are watching. Cliff Nyandarua is saying he's tuned in from Moi University, Kenya. Thank you very much, Jeff. We have Ellie. Ellie is saying, glad to be here. I'm a boiler specialist. I know you also mentioned about some professionals or the areas of specialization around the oil and the gas. We have also Ellie Olango saying, our major challenge is oil prices. Most manufacturers are using firewood as fuel in boilers. Petroleum energy could be ideal. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and comment on that. Comment on that. And this is really a very serious issue. It's not just boilers, but if you look particularly in Africa, and to some extent India, and a few places in the rest of the world, there are billions of people who don't have access to electricity, to safe thermal fuels. The EPA in America identified the #1 cause of avoidable death in the world No, I'm sorry, the World Health Organization, not the EPA, the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization identified the number one cause of avoidable deaths to be air pollution. And 2/3 of that was indoor air pollution. And almost exclusively driven by the use of wood, crop waste, and animal waste for home heating and cooking. And you've probably, some of you have seen this, experienced this firsthand. The amount of smoke and particulates. There are more children who die from pneumonia and other diseases related to burning wood and crop waste and in their homes than die from malaria, dysentery, and AIDS combined, which are the next three killers. So if you look at the importance of this in improving individuals' quality of life, it's huge. And so oil prices are actually providing safe and affordable prices really critical, and providing natural gas, which is the cleanest of those, would be an amazing opportunity. So thank you, Ellie, for bringing that up.
Wow, thank you very much. The other one is from we can also from Alphonse is saying watching from Masai Mara University. Thank you very much. Then the other question was before that we have Tryphon Olo, Technical University of Kenya. Thank you very much. So I have a question here from a viewer, and they are asking, what are the opportunities for other professionals other than the petroleum engineers?
Okay, well, so the oil industry, petroleum engineers in an oil company represent a small part of the total people that are hired. So we're there are if a company has 1,000 employees, they might have 20 petroleum engineers. Okay, so I know whether it's 20 or 50, I don't know, but I worked for company Union Pacific Resources, and we had thousands of employees, and we had a couple hundred, maybe 150, 200 petroleum engineers. So oil companies hire accountants, lawyers, secretaries, everything. A couple of specialist things that you might not be familiar with are supply chain experts. In other words, the people that are expert at connecting the materials that are required and getting them transported and making sure they are at the right place. There are safety professionals. Health, safety, and environment are hugely important for us. There are people that deal with corrosion, and always oil companies have lots of IT people. And so the broad range of things that any company needs, oil companies also need. So I think there are plenty of opportunities, particularly as oil companies expand for employment. And there are specialized skills employees who actually go out in the field and run the operations. So people with good electrical and mechanical skills, even if they're not engineers, have plenty of opportunities to operate in the field and do those kind of things. For example, people who understand how to maintain a compressor. Compressors, sometimes we need to gather the gas and make its volume smaller and its pressure higher, so we can get in a pipeline and transport it to where it needs to go. Well, somebody's got to make sure those compressors are maintained and fix them when they break. So there's a lot of those sorts of jobs that are the types of things that require some skills in the mechanical or electrical area, as well as computer people. Those are big ones that I would encourage you to consider. And those, by the way, those don't tend to get laid off as much as some of the others do.
Yeah. Thank you, Nathan. As we go on, Nathan, you mentioned something that was critical within the process, that indeed access to energy is directly correlated to economic development. We know for sure that some of the African countries have sprung out of oil and gas. For example, South Sudan, which is an immediate neighbor of Kenya. So where you see the exploitation of natural resource endowment in East Africa, for example, and we talk about a lot of offshore natural gas, for example, in Tanzania, where do you see graduates and students that are in the pipeline to graduate as petroleum engineering falling within the context of the nascent ecosystem of natural gas and oil in East Africa, for example?
Yeah. Actually, the biggest news has been, of course, the natural gas developments offshore East Africa. These are huge. And of course, while there are a few jobs that involve operating those fields where people go, live out there for 2 weeks and then come back for 2 weeks, but that's not a huge number of jobs. In reality, most of the work for offshore fields are, of course, done onshore. We try to minimize the number of people that are actually offshore. One of our goals with some of the technologies to we'd love to get that to zero. We, build it, get it going, and remotely operate all of it. Natural gas development is going to continue in offshore. Right now, there's some challenges associated with additional LNG capacity. We need to radically increase total liquefied natural gas capability so that we can get gas from some of these big discoveries to where they need to be. So wherever people are burning coal or wherever people are burning diesel to make electricity, I remember my time in Nairobi. Now it's been a long time and maybe things are much more reliable today, but I stayed in the hotel and the guy said, well, you may not want to, I forget how many floors they had. He says, you may not want to get too high up because the electricity is going out a lot these days. You're going to have to walk the stairs. It's like,
and that's what happened to me a few months ago.
Okay, so it's not completely gone. So I'm not sure you want to go to the 12th floor. Go to the 3rd floor. And so people burn diesel. So when that happens, then the hospital has a diesel generator so that, they can still keep the lights on for the hospital. Well, diesel is imported to Kenya.
True.
And so you're paying a lot for that diesel. If you developed it yourself and produced it there, and additionally refined it there, you would be able to do a lot better in terms of costs. We brought that was already brought up. Nigeria imports gasoline. Now, just think about that for a second. Nigeria exports crude oil. They produce way more crude oil than they need. But because of a wide variety of things, some of them are corruption, some of them are lack of, that a government has made poor decisions relative to development of the resources. They didn't develop the whole industry there. So they don't have enough crude oil refining capacity to satisfy internal needs. Kind of crazy. But you all know that you'd rather export higher value products. If you mine stuff and all you export is the ore, somebody else makes the money from refining that into the metal. Somebody else makes the money from taking that metal and making the products. The greater value added and the better and more high quality jobs come with value adding. And
that's where my next question is.
Pardon?
That's where my next question is, Nathan. Looking at the composition effect between China and Eastern Africa community, a lot of work attributed to China and India in terms of mining crude oil in Sudan and South Sudan. And by 2012, Sudan was already doing 470,000 barrels per day. Whereas we realize that China is already importing close to 5 million barrels per day of crude oil. Where is the career for new graduates in terms of innovation and trying to create value within the value chain of oil and gas in Africa, for example?
Well, the thing is, you've got a huge number of possibilities. If you'd asked me that question about, where is the opportunity in the U.S., I would talk about computers and everything else. But the reality is, your opportunities are very high. I would say those of you who are interested in the business and finance side have enormous opportunities. At some point, early in the oil and gas development, typical behaviors of countries is to license out their work, and almost all the work gets done by some foreign company with the technical skills and financial resources to take risks to do it, and they're looking for relatively high returns. So, do you know who operates the fields in Kenya? I mean,
yes, in Kenya, the lead miner is Tullow Oil, of course, contracted by the Kenyan government.
Okay, so Tullow is Tullow may not be, you may not hear of them in the same breath of Shell and BP, but they are big time players in Africa.
Absolutely,
and certainly they have the financial resources and technical skills to do projects like that. But ultimately, over time, and so if Tullow comes in, they will hire some people from Kenya, but you're going to rely a lot of them on their existing expertise. So as fields develop, you'll ultimately see companies develop in Kenya. Pandey Oil Company, maybe, and you might.
It's going to happen soon.
Yeah, going to happen, and so you might, if you may not know this, but it's very frequently what we do is we have 5 or 6 oil companies that own a project. Now, there will probably be a national oil company, or there probably already is, and they'll own 49% or 51% or some fraction of the total. But and so there will be job opportunities there. But a lot of times the other is not all Tullow. It might be Tullow plus 4 or 5 other companies, and they pool their resources and diversify their risk, so that if one thing fails, then they're not out of business. And if you have a business where there are 5 opportunities and 2 of them are going to fail and 3 of them are going to succeed, one of them succeed really well, would you rather have 20% of each one of them, or bet all your money on one of them? Well, if it meant that 40% of the time you were going to be out of business, it makes more sense strategically sometimes to share these risks. So there are going to be a lot of opportunities out there for different oil companies, and some of those will come from the way Tullow started. It's an interesting story. You should go back and look a little bit at their history. But a lot of these people started out as, the big oil companies you've heard of, and learned and took advantage of, entrepreneurial behavior to take risk and find financing and take those steps. So that's, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And thank you very much. I think we will ask you probably the last question for the day. Then we will allow feedback and perhaps wrap up this in another 5 minutes. So in terms of where we are headed to, and what I hear you say is that a majority of the opportunity is in oil and gas companies that are working in Africa, for example. But of course, there is also still an opportunity to leverage on startups. Shell, for example, entered the Kenyan market in early, 1960s. And for another 60 years down the line, we've seen a lot of work happen in that ecosystem. What is the opportunity for startups and entrants? And say university students graduating in the sector of petroleum engineering, wanting to have a career of their own and a startup of their own?
Yeah. Well, I love that question because it lets me tell a story. I was working in Oman 20 plus years ago. Oman is a country that has a lot of oil production and a lot of mature oil production, meaning late stages in its life. And I had a chance to talk with some high-ranking people in the ministries there. And I said, you know, if this oil production was in America, it wouldn't be mainly Shell and a little bit Oxy. You would have dozens of companies, and they would all be competing for this. And you would find some, you know, a lot of these would be really small companies, and a lot of them would be startups from here. They weren't very receptive, but today that's already come to pass, and 15% of the oil production in Oman is from little, very small companies. Oxy has gotten to be a pretty big company, but their percentage of the total in Oman has also gone up. You know, Shell has got a long and impressive history of going into countries for, you know, these decades of times, usually providing their products, you know, the refined products, but also tying that in with their oil and gas development activities. And so Shell is a long time player in Africa, but these opportunities for startups, the biggest numbers of startups actually are not just oil companies. It's hard to start an oil company. It takes more capital risk, but some service companies and people who provide services. So you're going to see, you know, as drilling activity happens, Schlumberger and Baker Hughes and Halliburton and others are going to be more likely to hire local people in terms of total numbers than the oil companies are, just at least for the super active years of development. And there are plenty of people. You go look in West Texas, there are plenty of people who compete in those markets. And so there are going to be opportunities in the service sector as well as the oil and gas sector for someone who has entrepreneurial skills and wants to be in the business. The oil and gas activity has historically been very strong in being able to provide funding and have opportunities for people who want to go out on their own.
Well, very well. I think that's a good point to end it, Nathan. Great opportunities for startups in the service sector for oil and gas. It has been worthy speaking to you and indeed sharing a bit of your experience within the 40 years of your career, from basically the tough sessions of physics and chemistry in there, which as a social scientist I could only nod to. But I believe most of our students and most of our young graduates that are pursuing this as a key area of interest have benefited from your talk. We encourage our listeners and viewers to interact with us on our Facebook platform and YouTube. Please contact Corporate Career Academy for any further details on this topic and many more that relates to young graduates getting into the industry. So a very big thank you, Nathan, for all that you've shared with us this afternoon. I will give you this opportunity just in case you have one last word for our viewers.
No, I just encourage everyone to stay safe out there.
Okay. Thank you very much. And if you find time again, please visit We will be able to this time take you to the fields where the reality happens, so that you don't have boring hotel meetings, but experience the hot suns of Turkana and other places where we mine oil and actually do a bit of refining locally. Until next time, I thank you everyone for sparing time to be with us this evening.
Corporate career responsibility is a call to all experts and consultants to give back their time, skills, knowledge, and expertise to mentor and nurture future industry leaders. Are you passionate in nurturing future industry leaders and professionals who will take enterprise to a higher level? Corporate Career Academy, together with Student TV, is giving you an opportunity to share your knowledge, skills, and mentor students and young professionals.